Everyone says the Philippines is cheap. Cheap rent, cheap food, cheap lifestyle. And at first, it feels true. You land, exchange your dollars, and suddenly everything looks like a bargain. A meal that costs less than a coffee back home. A ride that feels almost free. A country where people proudly say, "You can live like a king here." But here's the part nobody warns you about. The Philippines is only cheap from a distance. The moment you stop being a tourist, the math changes. Because the real cost of living here isn't written on price tags. It's hidden in compromises, in systems, in time lost, in comfort quietly taken away. And that's why so many people move here excited, then slowly adjust their expectations, then start asking themselves uncomfortable questions they never planned to ask. Not because the Philippines is bad, but because cheap doesn't always mean easy, and it definitely doesn't mean simple. The first few weeks feel like winning the lottery. You eat out constantly because cooking feels unnecessary. You take rides without thinking about distance. You rent a place quickly because everything seems affordable compared to where you came from. But affordability is deceptive when it's relative, not absolute. What no one tells you is that most of the numbers people quote are based on local standards, not foreign expectations. And once you try to live with the standards you're used to, reliable electricity, consistent internet, quiet nights, clean water pressure, predictable services, the price starts climbing in ways that don't show up in YouTube thumbnails. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The Philippines rewards flexibility, not money. If you can tolerate inconsistency, noise, delays, and improvisation, it feels cheap. If you need predictability, structure, and peace of mind, it quietly becomes expensive. And that's where the illusion begins to crack. Because rent isn't just about how much you pay. It's about what you're forced to accept at that price. 2 apartments can cost the same. One looks perfect online, the other feels livable in person. One has strong internet but constant power cuts. Another has stable electricity but paper-thin walls. Another is affordable but only if you're willing to live far from everything you actually need. And slowly, you realize something unsettling. You're not choosing what you want. You're choosing what you're willing to tolerate. That's when people start upgrading just a little. A slightly better neighborhood, a slightly more reliable building, a slightly quieter street, a slightly more Western-style setup. Each upgrade seems small, but stacked together, they quietly erase the cheap label everyone promised you. And that's before we even talk about what happens when you try to live like a normal adult instead of someone permanently on vacation. Because vacations hide problems, daily life exposes them. At first, you laugh off the small inconveniences, the late deliveries, the internet cutting out during important moments, the power going off when you least expect it, the sudden fees nobody mentioned. But over time, these things stop being funny. They become friction, mental load, constant adjustment. And here's the part that shocks most newcomers. You don't leave the Philippines because it's expensive. You leave because maintaining a comfortable life here costs more energy than you expected. Money is only one part of the equation. Time, patience, and emotional resilience are the rest. And the biggest mistake people make is thinking they can calculate this country like a spreadsheet. They can't, because the real expenses don't hit all at once. They arrive slowly, quietly, after you've already committed. Which is why so many people say, "It's cheap here," right before they start changing their lifestyle, lowering standards, or planning an exit. And the deeper you stay, the more you realize that rent, the thing everyone focuses on, is actually the least honest number in the entire cost of living conversation. Because rent isn't where the real trade-offs begin. They begin the moment you ask yourself where you actually want to live, and why that choice suddenly costs more than you were led to believe. And once you understand how housing really works here, the entire idea of cheap living starts to feel dangerously incomplete. Rent is where most people think they've cracked the code. They see listings online and think they've found the secret. Modern apartment, low monthly price. Photos that look good enough to screenshot and send to friends back home. But here's the reality most newcomers learn the hard way. Rent in the Philippines isn't expensive because of the number. It's expensive because of access. Access to reliability, access to location, access to peace. The price you see is only the starting point. What matters is what that price doesn't include. A cheap apartment in the Philippines almost always asks for something in return. Sometimes it asks for your sleep. Because the walls are thin, the neighbors are loud, and karaoke doesn't respect time zones. Sometimes it asks for your productivity. Because the internet slows down without warning, or the power cuts out during work calls, or both happen at the same time. Sometimes it asks for your safety, because the area looks fine during the day but feels very different at night. And sometimes it asks for your time. Long commutes, unpredictable traffic, distances that don't look far on a map but take hours in real life. This is where the misunderstanding begins. People compare rent prices directly to their home country. They say, "I was paying this much back home, now I'm paying half." But they're not comparing the same thing. They're comparing price, not quality of life. In many cities in the Philippines, cheaper rent usually means one of three things. You're far from where you actually need to be. You're sacrificing comfort you didn't think you'd miss. Or you're living in a building that looks fine until you've stayed long enough. And that's when the upgrades begin. You move closer to the city center. The price jumps. You want a building with an elevator that always works. The price jumps. You want backup power, reliable water pressure, decent security, and a quieter environment. The price jumps again. Suddenly, the rent you're paying doesn't feel so cheap anymore. Not because it's high, but because it's high relative to what locals pay, not relative to what foreigners expect. And this creates a silent tension. You're paying more than locals, but you're still not getting what you'd consider normal back home. This is the uncomfortable middle ground few people talk about. You're not poor enough to live fully like a local, and not rich enough to isolate yourself from the system. So you adapt. You start choosing apartments based on workarounds instead of preferences. You tolerate noise because the internet is stable. You tolerate distance because the building has backup power. You tolerate smaller spaces because the neighborhood feels safer. And slowly, your definition of cheap shifts. Because the real cost of rent in the Philippines isn't measured monthly. It's measured in daily adjustments. Every time you plan your schedule around traffic. Every time you delay work because of outages. Every time you accept something you wouldn't have accepted elsewhere. And here's something most people don't realize until much later. Rent isn't just housing here, it's a filter. It filters who can live comfortably. It filters who burns out quickly. It filters who stays long-term and who quietly starts looking for alternatives. And once you solve rent, or think you've solved it, you run straight into the next illusion. Food. Because yes, food is cheap in the Philippines. Until you stop eating like you're on vacation. And start eating like you're trying to stay healthy, productive, and sane every single day. Food is the statistic everyone uses to prove the Philippines is cheap. They show receipts, street meals, small bills that look impossible compared to Western prices. And they're not lying. Food can be cheap here. But what they don't tell you is what kind of food stays cheap and what kind quietly doesn't. At first, it feels exciting. You eat out constantly because it's affordable. You try local dishes. You enjoy the convenience of never cooking. But over time, something shifts. Cheap food in the Philippines is optimized for cost, not nutrition. It's heavy on rice, oil, salt, and sugar. Vegetables are often limited, repetitive, or overcooked. Protein portions are small unless you pay extra. For a few weeks, it feels fine. For a few months, you start to notice it. For a year, your body definitely notices it. And this is where the real cost begins. If you're okay eating whatever is cheapest, food stays cheap. But if you care about energy, health, digestion, or long-term well-being, your budget changes fast. Fresh produce isn't always cheap. Quality meat isn't cheap. Imported food definitely isn't cheap. And many people don't realize how much of what they're used to eating is actually imported. Cheese, certain fruits, whole grains, specific spices, anything labeled organic or healthy. Suddenly, your grocery bill doesn't look like the Philippines everyone promised you, and then there's availability. You can afford something. But can you find it consistently? Some days, yes. Other days, no. You start planning meals around what's available, not what you want. You visit multiple stores for basic items. You compromise more often than you expect. And if you decide to cook regularly, another surprise appears. Kitchen setups in many rentals are minimal. Limited counter space, basic appliances, poor ventilation. Cooking becomes possible, but not always pleasant. So people fall into a pattern. They eat cheap food during the week. They treat themselves on weekends. They justify higher spending as balance. Over time, that balance quietly becomes the norm. And eating out, even casually, adds up faster than people admit. Because cheap meals are cheap one at a time. But daily convenience has a way of inflating totals without being noticed. And here's the detail few people talk about. Food costs here aren't just financial. They're mental. Deciding where to eat. Checking if a place is open. Wondering if quality will be consistent. Avoiding places that made you sick once. These micro-decisions stack up. And when you try to recreate the diet you had before moving, the foods that made you feel normal, the Philippines stops feeling cheap very quickly. This is why many long-term residents develop a strange relationship with food here. They don't hate it, they don't love it. They manage it, and managing anything daily carries a cost that doesn't show up on receipts. But food is still only one layer. Because once you live somewhere long enough, eating well isn't your biggest concern anymore. Staying healthy becomes the real question. And that's when people start learning about healthcare, visas, and the quiet anxiety tax that comes with needing help in a system that isn't built around you. Healthcare is where the idea of cheap living becomes dangerously misleading, because nothing feels expensive until you actually need help. On the surface, it looks fine. Consultations are affordable. Basic checkups don't cost much. Pharmacies are everywhere, and for minor issues, the system works well enough. But the Philippines runs on a simple rule most newcomers don't understand at first. Healthcare here is pay-as-you-go, not safety net-based. No insurance, you pay up front. Emergency, you pay before treatment. Specialist, you pay again. Hospital admission, you pay deposits before anything starts. And this changes how you experience illness completely. Back home, getting sick is stressful. Here, getting sick is stressful and strategic. You start asking questions most people never think about. Which hospital can I afford? Which one will actually treat me properly? Which one will accept my insurance if I even have one? And insurance itself is another hidden cost. Local insurance plans are limited. International plans are expensive. Many people delay getting coverage because they feel fine, until they don't. And when something serious happens, the illusion shatters fast. Private hospitals offer good care, but they're priced for foreigners and the upper class. Public hospitals are affordable, but overcrowded, slow, and emotionally draining if you're not used to the system. So people exist in a constant middle state. They hope nothing goes wrong. They postpone checkups. They manage issues instead of addressing them. That's the anxiety tax nobody includes in cost of living breakdowns. And it's not just healthcare. Visas quietly add pressure to everyday life. At first, the visa process seems easy. Extensions are available. The rules look flexible. But flexibility comes with friction, regular renewals, paperwork, lines, fees that change, rules that are interpreted differently depending on where you go. You're always counting days, always checking stamps, always aware that your stay depends on compliance. You're not fully settled, even if you live here for years. That feeling never fully disappears. And when healthcare and visa concerns overlap, stress multiplies. You don't just think about treatment. You think about legality. You think about travel restrictions. You think about what happens if something goes wrong at the wrong time. This is where many people start realizing something uncomfortable. Living cheaply is easy when life is simple. Living cheaply during complications is not. And complications aren't rare. They're inevitable. The Philippines doesn't punish you with high prices. It challenges you with uncertainty. And uncertainty has a cost. You feel it in the background, in the planning, in the hesitation to fully relax, and once you start noticing that tension, you begin paying attention to smaller things, the everyday systems that quietly demand your patience. Things like electricity, internet, water, the basics you never thought about before, until you live somewhere where they don't always behave the way you expect. Utilities are where daily life in the Philippines quietly tests your patience, not in dramatic ways, in small, repeated interruptions that slowly change how you live. Electricity, for example, usually works until it doesn't. Power outages aren't constant everywhere, but they're common enough to be planned around. Sometimes scheduled, sometimes sudden. Sometimes lasting minutes, sometimes lasting hours. And when the power goes out, everything else pauses with it. Fans stop and air conditioners shut down. Internet routers go offline. Water pumps stop working in many buildings. This is why buildings with backup generators cost more. Not because generators are luxurious, but because they protect you from disruption. And once you've experienced a few outages at the wrong time, you start prioritizing that protection, which raises your rent. Again, water seems simple until pressure drops unexpectedly, until supply is cut for maintenance, until you realize some buildings rely on pumps that need electricity to function. You start storing water just in case. You adjust routines around availability. You learn to expect inconsistency. Internet is another lesson. It's affordable. It's fast on paper. And it's unreliable in ways that matter. Speed fluctuates. Connections drop. Service varies dramatically by building, not just by provider. Two neighbors can have completely different experiences with the same plan. And if your work depends on being online, this becomes more than an inconvenience. People end up paying for two connections, a primary line and a backup, mobile data as insurance. Not because they want luxury, but because reliability isn't guaranteed. Each workaround adds cost, not massive amounts, but enough to erode the cheap living narrative over time. And then there's maintenance. Repairs don't always happen quickly. Coordination takes effort. Follow-ups are often necessary. You learn that persistence matters more than urgency. So you adapt. You charge devices early. You plan workaround outages. You accept slower responses. And this adaptation becomes part of daily life. Here's the important part. None of these issues are deal breakers on their own, but together they create friction. Friction changes behavior. You go out more because home isn't always comfortable. You spend more because convenience becomes valuable. You tolerate less because your energy is already stretched. And slowly, the Philippines stops feeling like a place where you're saving money and starts feeling like a place where you're managing systems. This is when transportation begins to matter more than people expect. Because getting from place to place isn't just about cost here. It's about time, energy, and how much of your day disappears between point A and point B. Transportation in the Philippines is cheap in theory. A jeepney ride can cost less than $1. A tricycle might only set you back a few pesos. Grab or taxi apps are often cheaper than back home. But cheap doesn't equal convenient. And convenience has a hidden price that starts to add up in ways most newcomers don't anticipate. Traffic is the silent tax on your day. It isn't just bad during rush hours. It's bad all the time in many major cities. Distances that look short on a map can take hours to traverse. And public transport isn't always reliable. Jeepneys can skip stops or get overcrowded. Buses might run late or not show at all. Tricycles and motorbikes are flexible but limited in comfort and safety. So people start adjusting. They leave earlier. They plan alternate routes. They pay extra for private transport. And every adjustment quietly chips away at the cheap promise. Then there's the wear and tear on your energy and body. Bouncing through uneven roads, sweating through traffic jams, standing in long lines under the sun. What looks like a 50 ride becomes hours of stress and fatigue. If you rely on private vehicles, the story is similar. Fuel costs, maintenance, insurance, and parking fees are unpredictable. Road conditions vary dramatically, and you're constantly balancing efficiency, cost, and safety. Suddenly, time itself becomes currency. Every minute spent in transit is a minute you cannot spend working, relaxing, or exploring. And time lost often translates into hidden expenses, paying more for convenience or losing opportunities to earn. Even locals adapt. They plan their lives around traffic. They avoid certain roads at specific times. They manage expectations constantly. And foreigners quickly realize that cheap transport isn't cheap when measured by overall lifestyle impact. Beyond money, it's energy, patience, and mental space that are being spent. And the problem doesn't stop with getting around. It bleeds into lifestyle choices. Where you live, where you work, what social activities you can pursue, and quietly inflates daily costs in ways nobody ever warned you about. Which brings us to another hidden trap: lifestyle inflation. Because once you start earning, or even just feel comfortable with local prices, it's tempting to upgrade constantly. And each upgrade quietly chips away at the cheap life illusion. Lifestyle inflation is the silent killer of the cheap Philippines dream. At first, you're thrilled. Street food is enough. Jeepneys are fine. Small apartments are okay. But human nature is predictable. Once your income stabilizes or even slightly increases, your habits quietly shift. You start upgrading: a slightly bigger apartment, a building with more reliable electricity, a kitchen with better appliances, a neighborhood that feels safer. Each upgrade is small, harmless even. But collectively, they transform your budget. Dining out shifts from street stalls to nicer restaurants. You want more comfort when working from home. You buy imported groceries to replicate what you were used to. Even small indulgences, coffee, snacks, weekend trips, begin to add up. And suddenly, the lifestyle you thought was cheap is now moderately expensive. Not because prices changed, but because your standards did. What shocks many people is how quickly these expenses accumulate. A few upgrades per month seem manageable. But over a year, they quietly double or triple your original budget. Even entertainment contributes. Streaming services, local events, weekend trips to tourist spots. All affordable individually. Expensive when combined over time. And here's the part that catches most newcomers off guard. You aren't just spending money. You're paying for stability and peace of mind. Reliable internet, predictable electricity, quiet neighborhoods, all of these were free luxuries in your imagination of cheap living. But reality demands payment, not just financially, but in decision-making, planning, and trade-offs. Then there's social pressure. Living in an expat bubble or local community, comparisons are inevitable. You notice neighbors upgrading, friends traveling more often, people dining at places you haven't tried yet. Subconsciously, you match that lifestyle. And with each adjustment, cheap fades further into memory. By the time many people truly understand it, they realize something critical. The Philippines isn't inherently expensive. It's the cost of maintaining a lifestyle that feels safe, comfortable, and modern that quietly becomes expensive. And this pattern repeats across all aspects of daily life. Housing, food, transport, utilities. All small, seemingly trivial choices that quietly accumulate into a monthly outflow far larger than anyone's initial expectation. But lifestyle inflation isn't just financial. It's also psychological. Every compromise you make, choosing convenience over cost, comfort over savings, subtly changes your perception of value. Cheap becomes acceptable only in the absence of better options. And soon, better options feel necessary. Which is why, after months or years, many long-term residents whisper the same realization. Living cheaply here is more about managing trade-offs than saving money. And this brings us to the final reality, the thing nobody warns newcomers about. Because when all these factors collide, the Philippines stops feeling like the bargain paradise everyone promised. It becomes a complex balancing act of money, time, and mental energy. And now, it's time to explore the last piece of this puzzle, The shocking, total reality that will make you reconsider everything you thought you knew about living cheap in the Philippines. After months of juggling rent, food, utilities, transport, and lifestyle upgrades, the final reality hits most people like a slow, unexpected wave. Cheap living isn't about money, it's about adaptation. It's about managing unpredictability, discomfort, and compromise every single day. By now, you understand. The low rent you loved at first came with thin walls, unreliable power, and traffic-filled commutes. The cheap meals you adored were often nutritionally weak, inconsistent, or inconvenient to find. Healthcare, visas, and emergency planning quietly demand both time and hidden money. Utilities fluctuate without warning, and transportation consumes hours you didn't expect to lose. Even small lifestyle upgrades, once considered indulgences, quietly turn into necessary expenses. Add all of this together, and suddenly the cheap life illusion vanishes. Yet there's a reason foreigners stay. It's not just affordability, it's culture. It's community. It's the warmth of people, the rhythm of local life, and the small freedoms that feel impossible back home. But appreciating it requires a different mindset. You stop measuring costs purely in dollars. You start measuring them in resilience, patience, and adaptability. In how much inconvenience you can tolerate while maintaining sanity and comfort. In the mental energy you invest in keeping life smooth even when systems fail. For some, this trade-off is worth it. For others, the cheap label becomes a trap, a mirage that slowly erodes expectations until they start recalculating everything. Rent, food, transport, even where they can live safely. And this is the truth nobody tells you before you move. The Philippines is cheap, only until you experience it fully. It's affordable in headlines. It's cheaper than many Western countries at first glance. But the real cost? It's hidden, layered, and cumulative. If you want to truly live here comfortably, the numbers on paper are just the beginning. You must account for unpredictability, frustration, time lost, and subtle lifestyle inflation. You must be ready for a life where money doesn't solve everything, and patience often costs more than dollars ever could. So, before you think you found a paradise where living is effortless and cheap, take a closer look. Understand the hidden costs, plan for them, adapt to them. Because only then can you truly enjoy life in the Philippines without being blindsided. If you want more videos that reveal the real cost of living in different countries, hit subscribe and make sure you don't miss the next one.